When British Airways Flight 142 touched down at London Heathrow on the morning of March 19, 1987, ground operations noted something immediately unusual in the post-flight documentation. The Boeing 737-200, registration Golf Bravo Echo Charlie Tango, had departed Shannon, Ireland at 06:47 Zulu time. According to air traffic control records at Shannon and Heathrow, the aircraft had landed at 09:23 Zulu. Flight time recorded 2 hours and 36 minutes. Standard duration for that route, approximately 1 hour and 23 minutes. The discrepancy was 73 minutes. But according to the cockpit voice recorder, the flight deck crew experienced what they logged as a routine 1 hour and 18-minute crossing. No delays, no holding patterns, no diversions. The fuel burn matched a flight of 1 hour and 18 minutes. The passengers reported a normal flight of just over an hour. Yet every clock synchronized with coordinated universal time, every radar station, every automated logging system across 2 countries recorded the same departure and arrival stamps. By those measurements, the aircraft had been airborne for 2.5 hours, but no one on board remembered it that way. The morning of March 19th began unremarkably. British Airways Flight 142 was a positioning flight, what the industry calls a ferry or deadhead service. The 737 was being moved from Shannon back to Heathrow for scheduled maintenance. On board were Captain David Ashford, age 42, with 18 years of commercial aviation experience, and First Officer Colin Matthews, 34, with 9 years on type. Also aboard, 3 cabin crew members and 6 off-duty British Airways personnel traveling as non-revenue passengers. No fare-paying customers. Total souls on board, 11. The aircraft had arrived in Shannon the previous evening due to a minor hydraulic issue that had been resolved overnight by contract maintenance staff. All systems were signed off as operational. Weather across the Irish Sea and southern England was reported as clear, with scattered clouds at 12,000 feet. Surface winds light and variable, visibility unlimited. It was, by all standard metrics, an ideal morning for a short overwater crossing. The 737 pushed back from stand 7 at Shannon at 06:41 Zulu. Taxi clearance was issued without delay. The tower handed the flight off to Shannon Approach at 06:46. 1 minute later, Flight 142 rotated from runway 18 and began its climb to flight level 280, the assigned cruise altitude for the eastbound track. First Officer Matthews was the pilot flying. Captain Ashford handled communications. At 06:52, Shannon Approach handed them to Shannon Control, the area control center managing the oceanic airspace west of Ireland. Standard procedure. Shannon Control acknowledged the flight, confirmed the squawk code, and cleared them on course direct to their next waypoint, a navigation fix over the Celtic Sea, designated Bravo Alpha Lima 17. Estimated time to that fix, 34 minutes. From there, the aircraft would be handed to London Area Control Center and eventually to Heathrow Tower. Routine. Textbook. The crew settled into cruise, autopilot engaged, navigation systems locked on the programmed route. The cockpit was quiet except for the low hum of airflow and the occasional radio check. At 07:11 Zulu, Shannon Control called Flight 142 for a routine position report. There was no response. The controller repeated the call. Again, no response. The radar return was clear. The transponder was active and transmitting mode Charlie, which meant altitude information was being received. The aircraft was exactly where it should be, tracking eastbound at 280, speed consistent with normal cruise, but the radio was silent. Shannon tried a third time. Nothing. Procedure dictates that after 3 unanswered calls, The controller begins contingency measures. At 0714, Shannon contacted the adjacent sector to confirm whether Flight 142 had inadvertently switched frequencies early. Negative. Shannon then transmitted on the emergency frequency, 121.5 megahertz. Still nothing. Meanwhile, the aircraft continued on track. The transponder never dropped. The flight path never deviated. At 0719, Shannon logged the incident as a loss of two-way communication and flagged the flight for priority handling upon re-establishment of contact. Under international procedures, a Nordo flight, one with no radio communication, is tracked but not intercepted unless it deviates from its filed flight plan. Flight 142 did not deviate. It simply stopped talking. London Area Control Center received a handoff notification from Shannon at 0726. They were informed that Flight 142 was Nordo but on course and expected to remain so unless the situation changed. London placed the flight under heightened surveillance. Controllers watched as the radar blip crossed into United Kingdom airspace at 0734, precisely on the airway, altitude steady. At 0741, London attempted contact. No reply. They tried again at 0748. Silence. The aircraft descended on schedule at 0752, consistent with the expected top of descent point for a Heathrow arrival. At 8:03, it was handed to London Terminal Control. Still no voice contact. At 8:17, Heathrow Tower called the flight. For the first time in over an hour, there was a response. Captain Ashford's voice came through clearly. He acknowledged the tower, requested landing clearance, and confirmed his approach. His tone was calm, routine. The tower controller asked if they had experienced radio difficulties. Ashford replied that they had not. He said they had been in contact with Shannon and London without issue. The controller paused, then issued landing clearance. Flight 142 touched down on runway 27 left at 0923 Zulu. The landing was smooth. The taxi to the gate was standard. The crew shut down the engines, completed the checklist, and disembarked. Ground operations received the aircraft's journey log, a document automatically generated by the onboard flight management system. It recorded wheels up time at Shannon as 0647, wheels down at Heathrow as 0805. Total flight time, 1 hour and 18 minutes. Fuel loaded at Shannon, 4,200 kilograms. Fuel remaining on shutdown, 2,900 kilograms. Burn rate, 1,300 kilograms. Consistent with 1 hour and 18 minutes of cruise and descent. But the air traffic control clocks, synchronized across multiple facilities in 2 countries, told a different story. Shannon recorded wheels up at 0647. Heathrow recorded wheels down at 0923. Elapsed time, 2 hours and 36 minutes. The discrepancy was immediately flagged by Heathrow's operations supervisor. It wasn't a matter of opinion. The radar tapes were time-stamped. The ATC recordings were time-stamped. The secondary surveillance data pulled from every radar station that tracked the flight was time-stamped. Every external record agreed. The aircraft had been in the air for 2.5 hours. But the aircraft itself, and everyone on it, said otherwise. British Airways initiated an internal review that same day. The flight data recorder was pulled. The cockpit voice recorder was secured. Both devices were sent to the Air Accidents Investigation Branch, the United Kingdom's Aviation Safety Authority, for analysis. Investigators interviewed the crew. Captain Ashford was puzzled but insistent. He stated that the flight had been completely normal. No turbulence, no system warnings, no navigation anomalies, no unusual radio traffic. He recalled checking in with Shannon Control shortly after departure, receiving a frequency change to London around the time they crossed into UK airspace, and then contacting Heathrow Tower for landing clearance. First Officer Matthews confirmed the same sequence. Both men were asked specifically about the period between 07:11 and 08:17. That was the window during which Shannon and London had been unable to raise them. Ashford said he had no recollection of missing any calls. He said they had been monitoring the assigned frequency continuously. Matthews agreed. Neither man could account for why they hadn't heard the controllers or why the controllers hadn't heard them. The cabin crew were interviewed separately. All three reported a flight time of just over an hour. One of the attendants said she had checked her wristwatch shortly after takeoff, and again just before landing. She estimated the flight at 1 hour and 15 minutes. The off-duty personnel traveling in the passenger cabin were also questioned. Two were pilots. One was a senior flight engineer. All six reported the same experience: a short, uneventful flight. One of the pilots, a captain with 21 years of experience, said he had tracked their progress using his own navigation computer, a handheld device popular among commercial aviators at the time. He calculated their position and estimated time en route based on wind data he'd received before departure. His numbers aligned with a flight time of approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes. He was aware of no delay, no extended cruise segment, no holding. He was asked if he had looked at his watch during the flight. He said he had. Multiple times. He was certain the flight had lasted about 80 minutes, not 156. The cockpit voice recorder was examined first. It ran on a 30-minute continuous loop, meaning it only preserved the final half hour of audio before shutdown. That segment covered the descent, approach, and landing. Everything on the tape was consistent with a normal arrival. The crew's communication with Heathrow was clear and unremarkable. There was no indication of confusion, concern, or awareness of any timing irregularity. The flight data recorder, however, offered more. It logged parameters continuously throughout the flight. Altitude, airspeed, heading, engine performance, autopilot status, control inputs, and crucially, elapsed time since takeoff. The FDR timer is driven by the aircraft's internal clock, which itself is set manually by the crew before departure, but then runs independently based on the aircraft's oscillator. When the data was downloaded and analyzed, the FDR showed a total flight time of 1 hour, 17 minutes, and 42 seconds. The altitude profile matched a climb to 280, a level cruise, and a standard descent. The airspeed was consistent throughout. The autopilot had remained engaged for the majority of the flight. There were no anomalies in engine performance, no electrical faults, no deviations in heading. According to the black box, the flight had been textbook, and it had lasted 77 minutes. The radar data was reviewed next. Every radar facility that had tracked Flight 142 maintained digital records of position, altitude, and time. Shannon's surveillance system recorded the aircraft departing its airspace at 0734. London's system recorded it entering UK airspace at 0734. The timestamps matched. The aircraft's ground speed during cruise was recorded at an average of 462 knots. Distance from Shannon to Heathrow via the filed route, approximately 470 nautical miles. At that speed, expected flight time, 1 hour and 1 minute of cruise, plus climb and descent, totaling around 1 hour and 20 minutes. But the radar showed the aircraft in flight from 0647 to 0923. The position plots were continuous. There were no gaps. The aircraft never disappeared from radar. It never stopped transmitting. It simply moved across the scope, point by point, for 2.5 hours. Investigators cross-checked the radar clocks. All were synchronized with GPS-based time standards. They checked the transponder data from the aircraft itself. Mode: Charlie altitude readouts were consistent. The squawk code never changed. The only thing missing was the voice communication during that 73-minute window. Engineers examined the aircraft's communication systems. The VHF radios were tested on the ground. Both functioned normally. The antennas were inspected. No faults. The audio panel, which routes cockpit audio to the radios, was removed and bench tested. It operated within specifications. There was no technical reason the crew should have been unable to hear controllers, or controllers unable to hear them. One possibility considered was a rare atmospheric phenomenon called VHF ducting, in which radio signals are refracted by layers of air with different temperatures and humidity, causing transmissions to skip over their intended recipients. But ducting is temporary and localized. It does not last for over an hour, and it does not affect aircraft in level flight over open water where atmospheric conditions are relatively stable. Moreover, Flight 142 had been transmitting its transponder signal without interruption. That signal operates on a different frequency, 1030 MHz for interrogations and 1090 for replies, and was received clearly throughout the flight. If ducting had occurred, it should have affected both VHF voice and the transponder. It did not. The Air Accidents Investigation Branch convened a technical panel. Specialists in avionics, navigation, and flight operations reviewed the evidence. The question before them was straightforward but deeply unsettling. How could an aircraft be tracked by multiple independent radar systems for 2 hours and 36 minutes, while its own instruments, its crew, and its passengers all experienced a flight of 1 hour and 18 minutes? One early hypothesis was a failure of the aircraft's internal clock. If the oscillator that drove the FDR timer had malfunctioned, it might have run fast, compressing recorded time relative to real time, but oscillator drift is measurable and predictable. Even a severely degraded crystal oscillator would not produce a discrepancy of this magnitude without other symptoms, and the crew's wristwatches, which were independent of the aircraft's systems, also showed the shorter duration. One of the pilots had worn a Rolex GMT Master, a mechanical watch known for precision. He stated that the elapsed time on his watch matched his perception of the flight, approximately 80 minutes. Another theory involved the radar systems themselves. Perhaps the timestamps applied to the radar data were incorrect, but this would require simultaneous identical errors across multiple facilities in 2 countries, all of which used independent time sources. Shannon's radar was calibrated weekly. London's system was maintained by a separate organization under different procedures. Heathrow Tower's clocks were synced with the Royal Observatory. The probability of all these systems recording the same false timeline was considered negligible. A third possibility was human error in the flight plan filing or in the recording of departure and arrival times. But the departure time was captured by Shannon's surface movement radar, an automated system that tracks aircraft on the taxiway and runway. The arrival time was recorded by Heathrow's precision approach radar, which hands off to tower only when the aircraft is on short final. These systems do not rely on manual input. They log data automatically. Investigators reviewed the weather data for the entire route. Upper-level wind charts, temperature profiles, pressure patterns, and satellite imagery from that morning were analyzed. Conditions were benign. There had been no jet stream anomalies, no significant wind shear, no convective activity. The winds aloft were light and nearly aligned with the aircraft's track, providing a slight tailwind component. Under those conditions, the aircraft's ground speed would have been slightly higher than its true airspeed, shortening the flight time, not lengthening it. If anything, the environmental conditions would have supported a flight time even shorter than 1 hour and 18 minutes. One investigator noted that the tailwind alone could have reduced the expected flight time to under 75 minutes. Yet the radar said the aircraft took 2.5 hours to cover the same distance. The math did not work. Attention turned to the navigation systems. The Boeing 737-200 in 1987 was equipped with dual inertial navigation systems, or INS. These devices use gyroscopes and accelerometers to calculate position based on the aircraft's movement from a known starting point. Once initialized before takeoff, the INS continuously updates the aircraft's latitude, longitude, and ground speed. It does not rely on external signals. It is entirely self-contained. Both INS units on Golf Bravo Echo Charlie Tango were examined. The data stored in their non-volatile memory was extracted. Both units recorded the route from Shannon to Heathrow. Both showed a flight time consistent with 1 hour and 18 minutes. Both showed a ground track and distance that matched the filed flight plan. Both showed no navigation errors, no position drift, and no anomalies in acceleration data. The INS units had functioned perfectly, and they contradicted the radar. The official report, released 7 months later, was brief and unsatisfying. The AAIB concluded that the flight had proceeded safely from departure to arrival. All aircraft systems had operated within normal parameters. The crew had performed their duties correctly. There had been no threat to safety. However, the report acknowledged an unresolved discrepancy between the time recorded by external tracking systems and the time recorded by the aircraft's instruments and experienced by its occupants. The language was careful. The report did not say the radar was wrong. It did not say the crew was wrong. It simply stated that the discrepancy existed and could not be explained by any known technical, procedural, or environmental factor. The report made no recommendations. There were no findings of fault. It was classified as an unexplained occurrence. The file was closed. But the incident did not disappear. Within the aviation community, it circulated quietly. Controllers who had been on duty that morning were interviewed informally by colleagues. One controller at Shannon later said he remembered the flight clearly because of how strange it felt to watch a radar target move across his scope for over an hour without being able to talk to the crew. He said the aircraft's progress was smooth and unremarkable, except that it seemed slow. He had expected the flight to cross his sector boundary much sooner. Another controller in London said the same thing. He described watching the target for what felt like an unusually long time, even though the ground speed readout was normal. He couldn't explain the sensation. It was just a feeling that the flight was taking longer than it should. Captain Ashford and First Officer Matthews returned to duty after the investigation concluded. Both were cleared of any wrongdoing. Ashford retired in 1994. In an interview conducted for an aviation safety journal in 1998, he was asked about Flight 142. He said he still had no explanation. He was certain the flight had been short. He remembered being surprised when he learned that the radar had tracked them for 2.5 hours. He said it felt impossible. He was asked if he had any unusual sensations during the flight. Anything out of the ordinary, anything he might not have mentioned during the official investigation. He thought for a moment. Then he said there had been one thing. Around 30 or 40 minutes into the cruise, he had experienced a brief moment of disorientation. He described it as a flicker, like a split second where he felt disconnected, as if he'd lost his place in time. He said it passed immediately. He had attributed it to fatigue. He hadn't thought about it again until he was asked. Matthews was contacted for comment, but declined to be interviewed. In 2003, the flight data recorder from Golf Bravo Echo Charlie Tango was retrieved from storage as part of a research project examining anomalies in older FDR formats. A team of engineers at a British aerospace firm conducted a secondary analysis. They confirmed the original findings. Flight time: 1 hour, 17 minutes, 42 seconds. No data corruption, no timing errors. But they noted something that had not been emphasized in the original report. The FDR's internal clock had been set by the crew before departure. That clock ran throughout the flight and was stopped when electrical power was removed after landing. The elapsed time it recorded was based on its own oscillator. But there was another time reference within the FDR. Certain parameters were logged with a time of day stamp, derived from the aircraft's universal time clock, which was manually set before each flight, but could be cross-checked against known events. The researchers compared the time of day stamps at the start and end of the recording. The difference was 2 hours and 36 minutes. The FDR's internal elapsed timer said 1 hour and 18 minutes. The time of day stamp said 2.5 hours. Both were recorded by the same device. The researchers published their findings in an internal document that was never released publicly. According to a source who reviewed the document in 2007, the conclusion was cautious but striking. The FDR had recorded two conflicting timelines simultaneously. The elapsed timer, which counted seconds based on the oscillator, had measured one duration. The time of day stamps, which logged actual UTC time, had measured another. Both were embedded in the same data stream. The researchers could not reconcile this. They noted that if the oscillator had failed, the elapsed timer would show errors, but the time of day stamps would remain accurate. If the UTC clock had been set incorrectly, the time of day stamps would be wrong, but the elapsed timer would still function. In this case, both timelines were internally consistent. They simply disagreed with each other by 73 minutes. The document concluded with a note that no further investigation was planned. The passengers and off-duty crew members went on with their lives. One of the off-duty pilots, a man named Roger Hastings, later became a training captain for British Airways. In a private conversation in 2011, he mentioned Flight 142 to a colleague. He said he had never been able to shake the feeling that something had happened that morning, something no one understood. He said the flight had felt normal at the time, but in the years since, he had occasionally wondered if his memory was accurate. He said the mind has a way of smoothing over inconsistencies. He wondered if his memory of the flight duration had been influenced by the instruments, by the expectation of how long it should take. He wondered if what he remembered was real or constructed. He said he would never know. His colleague, who later recounted the conversation, said Hastings seemed uneasy when he spoke about it, not frightened, just unsettled. There have been other cases in aviation history where timing discrepancies have occurred, though none quite like Flight 142. In 1980, a Lufthansa cargo flight over the North Atlantic reported a discrepancy of 11 minutes between onboard time and ground-based time, later attributed to a clerical error in logging. In 1992, a private jet over the Pacific experienced a brief gap in ATC communication that was never explained but involved no timing anomaly. In 2001, a military aircraft conducting a test flight recorded an 8-minute gap between GPS time and the aircraft's mission computer time, traced to a software fault. But these incidents involved explainable causes or much smaller discrepancies. Flight 142 stands apart. 73 minutes is not a clerical error. It is not a software glitch. It is not atmospheric interference. It is a Gulf. The aircraft itself, Golf Bravo Echo Charlie Tango, remained in service with British Airways until 1995, when it was retired and sold to a European charter airline. It flew for another 6 years before being scrapped in 2001. No further anomalies were reported during its operational life. The flight recorders were replaced during routine overhauls. The navigation systems were upgraded. The airframe was maintained according to manufacturer standards. If there had been something physically wrong with the aircraft on March 19, 1987, it left no trace. The crew members who flew it afterward reported nothing unusual. To all appearances, it was an ordinary 737, unremarkable in every way. Official records remain sparse. The AAIB file is archived but not publicly accessible. British Airways declined to comment on the incident when contacted by researchers in 2016. Shannon and London Air Traffic Control Centers have no obligation to retain radar tapes beyond the required period, and those from 1987 are long gone. The only surviving evidence is the report itself, a handful of internal memos, and the testimony of those who were involved. And their memories, nearly 4 decades later, are fading. Some of the controllers have retired, some have passed away. The crew members are elderly now. The passengers have scattered. The aircraft is gone. What remains is a set of incompatible facts. A flight that lasted 1 hour and 18 minutes, according to everyone who experienced it. A flight that lasted 2 hours and 36 minutes, according to every system designed to measure it. No bridge between them. No explanation that satisfies both. There have been theories, of course. Enthusiasts and researchers have proposed everything from localized distortions in space-time to undetected software errors in the radar network. Some have suggested classified military tests in the area that might have interfered with navigation or communication systems. Others have pointed to geomagnetic anomalies or irregularities in the Earth's magnetic field. None of these theories have evidence. The area over which the flight occurred is one of the most heavily monitored and trafficked airspaces in the world. Hundreds of flights cross it every day. No other aircraft has reported anything similar. Flight 142 remains singular. One event, one morning, one crew, one airplane, one gap in time that no one can close. The question is not whether something happened. Something did. The evidence is too consistent, too redundant, too well documented to dismiss. The question is what it means that an aircraft and its occupants can move through space in a way that is measured differently by independent observers, all of whom are certain of what they recorded. The radar stations did not malfunction. The flight recorders did not fail. The crew did not lie. The clocks did not drift. Every instrument, every system, every human being involved reported accurately. They simply reported different realities. And if that is true, if it is possible for an object to exist in 2 durations simultaneously, then the implications extend far beyond a single flight over the Irish Sea. It suggests that time, at least as we measure it, is not as fixed as we assume. That under certain conditions, rare and poorly understood, the relationship between a moving object and the space through which it moves can become fluid. Not in theory, not in mathematics, in practice, on a Thursday morning, with 11 people on board. Flight 142 is not listed in most databases of aviation incidents. It did not crash. It did not injure anyone. It did not violate regulations. It simply landed 73 minutes later than it should have, without ever noticing. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling part. The crew had no idea. The passengers had no idea. If the radar had not been watching, if the clocks had not been synchronized, if the controllers had not tried to call, no one would have known. The flight would have been logged as routine, forgotten within days, absorbed into the thousands of flights that cross the North Atlantic every week. But the radar was watching. The clocks were synchronized. The controllers did try to call. And because of that, we know that on March 19th, 1987, something happened that no one can explain. The aircraft is gone. The crew is silent. The passengers have moved on. But the data remains. And the data does not lie. It simply refuses to agree. If you follow aviation mysteries and unexplained incidents, subscribe for future investigations.